I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we take a look at the harrowing yet inspiring journey of Lois Young. She's the author of a powerful book. It is called Along Came Hell, or So I Thought. This multi-award winning book reveals the dark secrets of family trauma and the transformative power of faith amidst the unimaginable. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Authors Tranquility Press for helping us put her in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support authors like her by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing her amazing book. The links are below this interview. Lois, great to see you here today on Spotlight.
Thank you.
What made you decide to tell your story in print?
Well, it all started the first night that we discovered that my husband had molested the granddaughters. And as I was lying in bed, I was wondering how it all happened. And then I started thinking about things that had taken place years ago. And I realized that all that had happened in preparation for this rough time. A daughter-in-law had been molested as a child, and she had kept quiet for years. And it wasn't until just a few years previous to this that she had talked to one of the cousins who was a counselor. And she was able that night to confront my husband. And my husband and I had been involved in prison ministry for 8 years, and I loved it. And I realized that was preparation for this, because I had an idea what it was like to be within a prison. And I thought, this is more than just happenstance. I mean, it's tragic, it's tearing a family apart, but there's all this background work that had taken place. And I thought, I've got to start writing this story, because God has been at work for years without us even knowing it. And that's what got me started.
Yeah, well, like I said, it's a difficult story to share, but it's an important story to share because other people go through similar experiences where people have been molested or abused, and there is a lot of like shame and guilt that is cloaked around all of this stuff. Yet it's important to get it out into the open, to put it in the sunlight, which of course is the best disinfectant for this kind of stuff. What was your initial reaction when you discovered your husband's betrayal?
Well, I had suspicions, but tonight I found out for sure it was a combination of, I finally know for sure. And I just got hot all over. I got cold all over. I didn't know what to feel. And my emotions, I've never been very emotional to start with, but everything shut down. I was just numb, and my mind was going 100 miles an hour. What am I going to do now? What are the kids going to do? What about the granddaughters? What about my husband? And it took me years before I started really feeling deep emotions over this whole event.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the ultimate betrayal in many ways. It's such a horrible thing to find out. How did you find the strength to confront such a devastating truth?
Well, it was, as I said, it's a faith story, and this might sound strange to a lot of people, but the Lord speaks to me through life experiences and memories of things with my grandkids when they were younger really helped me through. Because I had to deal with being alone. I wasn't lonely because I've always sort of been a loner, but to be alone is different. And no matter where you go, you don't know where your spouse is. Well, I knew mine was in prison, but how do I deal with alone? And I just remembered of my granddaughter when she was just about 7 years old. They moved into a brand new house. She had always shared a bedroom. She had a room to herself. And I said, how was it scary being in that great big room all by yourself? And she laughed at me and she said, Nana, my dad was just down the hall. And that so spoke to me that I am not alone,
Right.
that my Lord is always with me. And I need to, and story after story would come back to mind of things the kids would say, that would just that reminder that I am not going through this alone. I did have my family. My kids were amazing. But when they weren't physically around me, I knew God was. But it was a process to reach that point.
Such a strange irony also that you and your husband did prison ministry, and then he went to prison.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did prison ministry for 8 years. And I thought that is what my calling was. I loved it. And in prison, the men are never called by their first names. It's always their last name is how they're addressed in prison. And we could call them by their first names. So these guys, we never knew what they were in there for. That wasn't information we needed, but we would talk to them. We led studies, we prayed with them, and we could use their first names. And I could mention this later, but I will now. The night that happened, I no longer was able to use my husband's first name. I just could not say it. And I couldn't say my husband. I would say him. And it was about 8 years before I could say his name again. And the counselor I was going to said, "Why are you trying to protect your husband?" And I said, "Well, I'm not." And what I realized those years later, I was not using his name because your first name gives you your identity. And I was not allowing him his identity. I was protecting myself by not associating me with this guy that had a name.
And also your name humanizes you.
It's
You know what I mean?
you. That's right. It makes you very human. And I had no idea that's why, but and the first time I did it without even thinking, I shocked myself. Yeah. And I thought, wow, healing is taking place. And it was probably 8 years before I was finally able to say his first name.
What was it like writing this book and reliving these dark chapters?
It was slow. It was cathartic, and I wasn't sure why I was writing it. I thought maybe it was just for me to process, because that's the way my mind works. I love math and science, and I want explanations. And so it was writing everything I could remember, trying to make some sense out of everything. And it was healing. And then I would, my kids would ask me questions. I didn't question my kids about their experience because this is my story, not their story. But it was a necessary process, something I wasn't aware of when I was doing it. I would think, okay, I've got to be honest in this. I went back and read all the letters he had written from prison just to see what it was. And I was surprised because when he was writing me those, I didn't want to read them, or I would wait several days before I'd even open them. They would make me depressed. And I was going through them while I was writing it the last year or so. And I had none of the negative reactions anymore. And I started wondering, what did he go through? What was he dealing with? Because he could have no contact with family. And so it was just a good analytical process that helped me start getting in tune with how I was acting and reacting, and more in tune of what the Lord had been doing with me not being aware.
Yeah. How long did your husband serve in jail?
10 years. I should say my ex-husband, we are divorced. And that came when he was close to, it was after he got out of prison. He couldn't come home, but yeah, we are divorced. But
what became of him?
Excuse me?
What became of him? I mean,
okay.
10 years in jail, it's with that type of record, it's almost like your life's over, right?
Yeah. And just weeks before he was supposed to get out, he had an accident in prison and suffered a massive head injury. Ended up in the hospital for months, and then he went back into prison. And they wanted to release him as soon as they could, and they were trying to get me to bring him back home. And I thought, there's no way, I can't do it. And I couldn't find out what was wrong with him, because he had never signed the medical form for the release of medical information. And I couldn't sign for him, even though I had legal power of attorney. They said, you can't do that. So we didn't know what was going on. Anyway, we finally found out that the prison had to find a place for him. So he went to a halfway house. And then he had got COVID real badly, and They didn't know if he'd ever get off oxygen,
Mhm.
but he came through that fine, and he is now in a home, adult care home for men, up where our oldest son lives. And our son is taking care of his dad's finances, and he takes him out to breakfast every once a week or so. And but he is he's about 2 hours away from where I live. But
Son
he's
was able to forgive him, it sounds like.
oh yes, that has been absolutely amazing, including a son-in-law who he would. My daughter and I would go visit. I would go up on occasion. My daughter would go with me sometimes because she wanted to see her dad face to face. She said he was a good dad. What he did was terrible. But I want to be able to see him, to see his facial expressions, to watch his eyes, and to hear his humor, because my husband had a great sense of humor. But my son-in-law would take her up and drop her off, and then he'd go get some coffee and pick her up later. So she was having contact with her dad. And then my younger son and his wife went up a few times and visited. And then after he got out, our oldest son and his wife had a Christmas dinner the week before Christmas and invited their dad and me and the other two siblings, and they all came. And my son-in-law was going to leave, so because he didn't want to be there. But he was still at the house when my husband came in, and my son-in-law gave him a hug and stayed. And it was just absolutely amazing. But the kids all have contact when they're up in that area. Yeah, it's been a process, and he's asked for forgiveness, and they have forgiven. The granddaughters have forgiven. As one of those things, no matter what trauma you go through, whether it's a death in the family or whatever, or you've been hurt by somebody, forgiveness takes place, or just to get rid of those feelings and say, Lord, I am feeling so angry whenever I think of that, or I get depressed, or however we feel, and it's the emotions tied with whatever happened that keeps us tied up. And that's what we
The
need to deal with.
Christian values that permeated your family that allowed your children and grandchildren to
Absolutely.
forgive him?
Absolutely. They're all very involved in their churches. In fact, one of my grandsons, he's 20, how old is he now? 26, was just ordained recently, just through the work he does at his church. And they're all on worship teams and involved. And it's that generation after generation, it just blows me away, is the faithfulness of the Lord's work through families. I don't remember when our kids were growing up talking much about forgiveness and repentance, but we lived it, and they saw. And it's surprising what our kids learn that way. And most of them really developing in their life as Christians came once they were in college or in the Air Force or wherever they were, other influences, other churches. But they had the basics growing up. Always went to Sunday school, involved in youth groups and youth choirs, and it was just we just lived a normal life.
Yeah. How many victims did your husband have?
There were just 2 of the 3 granddaughters. The police did a lot of checking for other victims because he loved kids and kids loved him, but it was just 2 of the 3. And the one he did not molest was the oldest one, and she was as a very strong-willed little girl, and she was very black and white and very vocal. And the first time he tried patting her tummy, he was holding her and he went to pat her on the tummy, and she says, "Stop that, I don't like it." That was the end.
Yeah.
Never again. The other 2 girls were very much little loving little kids that just wanted everybody to be happy, and they became the victims. And yeah.
Did you receive any counseling?
The girls did a little. Both of them went for a short period of time. But they were sort of uncomfortable with it, but they had a lot of support from home. Their parents were always talking to them and letting them know this is not your fault, and talking to them about forgiveness. And one of them has married, and she's a kindergarten teacher. The other one is still single, and she still deals with a few things. with this. If somebody puts their arms around her waist, uninvited type stuff, it freaks her out a little. But she's dealing with that. But they both have. Well, I asked them just before I was done with my book. I thought I was done, and I asked them if they could talk about it yet, and they both said they were willing to answer questions. And so it was sort of interesting, because one thing I did ask them is, well, where did you see God in this whole experience? And one thing one of the girls said was, well, I'll back up. I had thought about reporting when I was suspicious, and I thought, well, if I report, I didn't have any proof. He just liked to play with the girls, push them in swings. If they were playing with Barbie dolls, he'd play Barbie dolls with them. He just enjoyed that, and I didn't like it. But there's nothing wrong with that, for a grandpa to play with his grandkids. So he had denied. I said I was suspicious. I told him that, and he said, I thought you knew me better than that. So I never reported it to anyone, and I didn't even tell my kids, because it was just my brain thinking those things. So when I was talking to this one granddaughter and about it, and I said that in one of my husband's letters, he had said, I wanted to stop, but I couldn't. And she said, but if you had talked to the police when I was 3-4 years old, I would have probably been afraid, or I wouldn't have known what they were talking about. And my parents probably wouldn't have believed you, because they didn't suspect anything. And so by the time that it was discovered, and he knew he was going to be reported, and he said he would turn himself in, my granddaughter said, maybe we waited that long just so he would reach the point to admit he had done it. The girls did not have to go to it, didn't have to testify in court. There was no trial. It was, he admitted it. And the counselor said, it doesn't happen that way. They never admit it, or very seldom admit they had done it. But my granddaughter said, it just might have been perfect timing. I don't know.
Something decent at the end, sparing the children the humiliation of having to testify or talk to experts about it, and reinforce the crime that had already been perpetrated against them,
And one thing I will say at this, both sets of parents did talk to their girls when they were little. And one of them, they would talk to her about inappropriate touch. Mm-hmm. And this granddaughter said, I really don't remember that, but there again, it probably didn't make any sense to me. Right. When I was 3, 4, 5 years old. And the other one, their parents talked to her about stranger danger. This was not a stranger. So both did what they thought they should, and the girls were young, and it was probably not talked about very often. I don't know that, but yeah.
It's the sad truth about sexual abuse and molestation is it's usually not strangers. It's the uncle or the father or the grandfather or the stepfather or something like that.
Older brothers. It could be, Yeah. So it's
the book is called Along Came Hell, or So I Thought. What do you mean by that?
Originally, I did not know what in the world I was going to do, because my husband was retired and got Social Security. It was ample, plus his retirement. I knew that would be gone. When a guy goes to prison, if he's on Social Security is cut off. So my salary, the money I had coming in, would be cut about in half. But the expenses aren't going to go down that much. And we did have debt. And I thought, what am I going to do with this? We lived on 6 acres, and they have to be mowed. I had never used the riding mower before. How do I deal with that? Just keeping up the house. I did the housework, but any repair, my husband did that. And then going to church, because he was known in town. He was supervised protective services. And so it hit big newspaper. And I thought, what am I going to do? If I go to the grocery store, I'm going to go really, really early so no one will see me because they know me and they're going to say, oh, see that lady over there? That's the one. Or the church. We were very active in our church. And I thought, well, if I go to, and he did move out of the house after it was discovered, and I moved into a motel. And people will say, well, where's your husband? And I couldn't lie and say, well, he's sick. And I didn't tell him, oh, he's living in a motel. What do I do? So I left. So my whole world sort of collapsed. I no longer had my church contact. I played in the handbell choir. I was involved in Bible studies. And one thing I've discovered through this and through some classes is our brain makes us think that we know what everybody else is thinking. And that's where I went, is I knew if somebody saw me that recognized me, they immediately would start thinking about me, talking about me, just, oh, see that lady, well, her husband, or I'm sure she knew and she didn't say anything. That's what my mind was doing. And so I isolated myself. And I wanted to run away. I wanted to get out of town where nobody would know me and I could start all over again. But you can't start all over again. You've got all that history. And my family was here. And so it was just a process of finally going to a church where I wouldn't be known and starting to be, okay, I will go to a Bible study, even though the people don't know me and I don't have to say anything. And it was a church my son went to, but it was a big enough church. I didn't sit with them and they didn't know I was a parent there. So I just started going to a Celebrate Recovery group for grief and loss, which I learned some, I found that I didn't have emotions then. I had a chart to fill, which emotion are you? Mm-hmm. Well, I was ticked off, and ticked wasn't one of my choices. So anyway, it's, but just the Bible studies of, we tend to put our identity like letters on an athletic jacket to identify us. So if you're a mom of a druggie, you might have MOD on your shirt and it's showing mom of a druggie. That's who I am. That's my identity. But Christ wants to remove that. That's not who he says we are. Who are we in his eyes? And so that's why, okay, I'm a WOF, wife of a felon. And every place I go, that's what I felt. I'm a wife of a felon. And by the time we got all through this journey, a good 8 to 10 years, I was able to still have WOF, but standing for a woman of faith was my true identity, not a wife of a felon. That was a fact, I was, but that's not the truth. In God's eyes.
It's a big burden, no doubt, when someone close to you is accused of something awful, whether it's this, whether it's murder, whatever it is. And there is a negative light shown on the family, unfortunately, which is completely undeserving. I mean, I've dealt with cases where a man has murdered another family and his family really needs to go into hiding and move to another community because everybody looks at them as, oh, their father, her husband was the one who did. And it's really a terrible, terrible thing. And it's part of the crime, actually, of what your husband perpetrated or what any criminal perpetrates. They're perpetrating it on the family, right?
Yeah. And one thing that's sort of interesting in all this is one of the first times I shared this with a women's group at church, several ladies came up to me and they said, when we read about it in the newspapers or see it on TV, we get all this anger and hatred toward the perpetrator and lock that guy up and don't let him out again. And the sympathy goes out to the victim. But they said, we had no idea how it affects the entire family. And that's one thing that I hope that this helps people see is when there is a crime of some sort, no matter what it is, it affects more than just the immediate person. It affects everybody in the family. And we all react differently, depending on how we are. We're all created different, and so we react differently. And and just because somebody doesn't react like me doesn't mean they're wrong and I'm right.
Right. Exactly.
I don't cry easily. So that doesn't mean if you're crying all the time, you've got a problem,
Exactly. You kind of touched upon it, but I was going to ask you, what do you hope readers take away from your book?
What I hope they take away is that it's almost a guarantee in life that there will be an experience where your world seems like it's been destroyed. You've been knocked to the curb, you've been kicked in the gut. But healing is possible. It is slow. It does not come immediately. It takes work. But for me, it was my faith. And it was almost every day, my prayer was, Lord, don't let me get so wrapped up in my emotions or lack of emotions that I don't see your hand at work. And sometimes it would be way down the road, something would happen. I said, oh, wow, this has been taking a place all this time and I had not seen it. And this is healing and I'm moving forward. Just to be aware, but it's trust and it's prayer and it's willing to do things you've never done before. I had to get back with people again. And so somebody says, take a watercolor class. A friend said, I'm taking one. And I had never painted before. And I found that I had some ability. And so it opened up a whole new world for me. And now going to book fairs with my book, I am going to those. It's not selling books, but it's a chance to talk to people, to say, yes, it's tough right now. Yes, it does take time. Forgiveness isn't just I forgive them, Lord, and then it's over. It comes up and it takes it's a process. New things come up in our memories and we have to sort of go, okay, Lord, I thought I'd forgiven, but that made me mad when I noticed that. I need to deal with anger that's still here. And it's a process, but it's there's always hope. There is, but to be just involved with positive community, supportive friends, and I was blessed having a close family. My kids have been amazing, even though they were each suffering their own ways. Yeah, it's
Well, your faith has sustained you. You've
yes,
handled a crisis with dignity, and that's to be applauded. You've carried on with your life and succeeded, which is great, and raised a beautiful family despite the challenges. So, and now you're helping others, which is a Christian thing to do as well. By sharing your story, other people might see themselves in similar situations or recognize signs that they perhaps were overlooking and that they shouldn't. And I think that's a great help to the public at large. The name of the book is Along Came Hell, or So I Thought. It is a multi-award winning book that reveals the dark secrets of family trauma and the transformative power of faith amidst the unimaginable. It is written by a very talented author by the name of Lois Young, and we've been delighted to speak with her today on Spotlight. Lois, thank you so much for being our guest.
thank you, Logan.
I appreciate your time. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time until next time on Spotlight.